Welcome to episode 142 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of this episode at the show notes, which is www.7, so the word all spelled out, SEVEN, health.com/142. A couple times a year, I take on clients, and client work is the core of my business and how I spend the vast majority of my time. And after working with clients for the last decade, I feel confident in saying I'm very good at what I do. And yes, I help clients with various symptoms, but actually it's much bigger than just removing symptoms. These are struggles that these individuals are obsessed with and are defined by. Their problem has become how they identify and think about themselves. My clients have often worked with multiple practitioners and are on the verge of giving up, and it really isn't uncommon for me to be the fourth or the fifth or the sixth person they've come to. And where I see myself being different to others is by combining science and compassion. So I'm evidence-based in what I do and have a strong grounding in physiology and why the body is functioning how it is. But at the same time, I'm compassionate and I listen to the mental and emotional side of the client's experience and know that these aspects are of equal importance to health as the physical side of things. And one of the aspects I like most about the work that I do is how positive the process is. People believe that they're going to have to give up so much, that it will be painful in so many ways, but they'll convince themselves that it's better for their long-term health. But what they find is that the change actually adds to their quality of life. They enjoy the change and their new life. Their physical, mental, and emotional health improves now, not in some distant, far-off time in the future. And after working together, my clients regain what they thought was impossible, having their period again, conceiving, feeling energized, purposeful and alive, and walking by a mirror without the dread of seeing their own reflection. I put out so much free material. The podcast is free, the blog posts are free, and while the free material I put out I stand behind, it is much more general. You have to discern what is and isn't relevant for you. But when we are working together, I'm the one who can sort through this and show you what is important, what is the low-hanging fruit, and what are the levers that will make the most difference. So if you want this kind of precision in helping you with your recovery for better health, now is your chance to work with me. If you're interested in finding out more, you can head over to www.7-health.com/help, so HELP, and there you can read more about how I work with clients and apply for a free initial chat.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. So on this week's show, I have another guest interview and I'm chatting with David McRaney. So David is a journalist and a writer and the host of the podcast You Are Not So Smart. He runs a blog by the same name, which explores self-delusion, and more recently has been writing a book about how people change their minds. So I've been following David's podcast for a number of years now. I've mentioned it on certain podcasts and I've written articles about it. And I mentioned in a recent episode about my love of psychology, and I get a really good dose of this from listening to his show. I've read one of David's books, which is also called You Are Not So Smart, which I really do highly recommend. And so as part of this episode, we really cover how humans aren't as rational as they think they are or we think we are. We look at different biases and heuristics, so confabulation bias, confabulation, the availability heuristic. We talk about social media and how online spaces often don't lead to fruitful conversations. So where it's either two people arguing but not really listening to the other person's point of view, or where people are in silos or echo chambers and are simply confirming their preconceived ideas. And David also talks about how to change people's minds, which is a topic of his newest book, which hasn't been published yet. And interestingly, on the topic of changing minds, I watched a fascinating documentary the other day called White Right. which is on Netflix. It's directed by Dia Khan, and she's a Norwegian-born filmmaker who now lives in Britain and is of Punjabi descent. She's Muslim. And the film is her spending time with white supremacists in the US. And it's amazing to see how many of the guys that she spends time with end up changing their minds and changing their beliefs because of her. And this is largely because of how she humanizes these people and spends time with them in a very compassionate way. So after having this conversation with David, it was great to then see the documentary and to see how people's minds can be changed, not by facts, but by, in Dia's case, by humanity. I should say that when I recorded this episode with David, I was only recently returned from Australia and was pretty jet lagged. So Ramsey took much longer to readjust coming back to the UK than when we were out in Australia. And so there were many nights or mornings where I was waking up at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. and having breakfast with him then and then hanging out for a couple of hours before getting to go back to sleep. So as part of this recording, I know I sound a little off and really leave David to do the majority of the talking. But that's enough for this intro. Let's get on with the show. Here is my conversation with David McRaney. Hey, David, thanks for joining me on the show today.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
So I have to say I'm a huge fan of your podcast, and I've been listening to it for maybe the last 2 or 3 years. I can't remember exactly when I discovered you, but I've referenced it many times on this show and in my writing. So I imagine there's some people or many people in my audience who've heard your name before. So I was kind of thinking of how I want to spend this time together and what I'd like people to get out of the episode. And I think it's probably similar to the goal of your first book, which is You're Not So Smart, which is just to demonstrate to people how irrational we are, we all really are, and that we're less in the driving seat than we would want to kind of imagine. I would love to be able to demonstrate that irrationality by going through different cognitive biases and heuristics and logical fallacies that you've written about or done on your podcast before. But I guess as a starting place, do you want to give a bit of background on yourself? How did you end up interested in biases and human irrationality?
Oh, well, yes, the way I came to what I do, and I've been doing, I wrote the book, You're Not So Smart, about 10 years ago now, and I've had the podcast going for 6 years. What happened was in university, I was studying psychology. That was what I had set myself to become, a psychologist. A therapist is what I wanted to be. And I got sidetracked into doing some stuff for the school newspaper, the college newspaper, and I really enjoyed what I did there. And I took a semester, I took a summer and did an internship for an actual newspaper, and I really enjoyed it a lot. And so when I came back to school, I changed my major from psychology to journalism, and I worked my way all through that, graduated, got a job, worked my way through that career for a while, and eventually got to a point where I was an editor and I wasn't writing very much. And I just wanted to have an outlet for writing, and I started a blog, and I had the inspiration for the You're Not So Smart blog was I was on YouTube, and I was watching Darren Brown do one of his mentalism sort of pranks where he went to public places, he would ask for directions, and when a person started giving him directions, he had 2 other people walk between him and the person giving the directions with a giant painting. And as they passed by, one of the people holding the painting would switch places with Darren Brown. And so now the person is giving directions to a completely different person. And he showed in this special he did that no one noticed. They just kept giving this completely new person directions as if they hadn't changed. And he did this with tall people, short, he switched himself out with tall people, short people, different gender, people with different skin colors. It so blew my mind. And I showed it to a bunch of people, and I don't know, just sort of activated some sense of epistemic humility or sensory humility or something in me that I was it really excited me, the idea that we are operating on sort of this best guess version of reality, and that it could be so easily messed with and we'd have no idea. And it made me think about how much of this kind of stuff is happening that we don't realize is happening on a daily basis. So, I recalled a bunch of the psychology that I had studied in school and how we had sort of touched on some of these topics. So I went and got the research for what he had done. Most of Darren Brown's stuff is based off some psychological research. He often partners with Richard Wiseman, who is sort of consults him. He's a psychologist who consults. He's like, you should do this as a show, or he's thinking of a show. He's like, this will help. And so that came from something called change blindness. And I've had Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris on my show, who were the researchers who looked into this, mainly Daniel Simons, and they became famous for the invisible gorilla experiment. But they had done this experiment first, and it was very simple. Someone would come to their office, and they would the experiment was set up so you had to turn in some paperwork. A student had to turn in some paperwork, and they would basically come to a sort of like hotel desk kind of arrangement. They'd turn in their paperwork. The person on the other side would duck down and then stand back up and give them their like certificate that they had turned it in. And but it would be a completely different person, and then they would like debrief people and ask if they had noticed. And in the actual experiment, they've done it in a number of different ways. About 30% of people don't notice. So it's not everyone, it's about 30%. But when you're making like a Darren Brown special, you can edit it so it seems like everybody does it. But still, at 30%, I was just astounded. And I could think that this has probably happened to me many times. So I looked into that, and I looked into inattentional blindness. That's when you can't tell when an image has changed right before your eyes, even though you're staring at it. And I sort of went down a rabbit hole of these perceptual biases, these perceptual illusions that we fall prey to.
Sure.
And that led me to start a blog about just that one thing. It was a period of time in which all that was happening. And there were micro blogs of all sorts at the time. And not long after that, what really happened, and I'll tell this part of the story quickly, is that I wrote an article on my blog about brand loyalty and what was the psychology behind it. And it just so happened that I used as an example people who favor iPhones and people who favor Android phones. And right about that time, an iPhone prototype was stolen by a blog called Gizmodo. And Gizmodo had asked me not long after if I'd be willing to let them put that article on their website, because they had put a lot of articles from around the internet about talking about brand loyalty and iPhones and Apple and stuff like that. And I said it was okay with me, and it linked back to my blog. And that's what brought in my first big avalanche of audience members. And that led to enough interest for it to become a book and eventually a podcast and all the rest.
And I mean, you mentioned Darren Brown there. I've been binging on his various Netflix specials, or various specials that are now appearing on Netflix. I've actually seen him in person, I think once or maybe twice before. He's simply phenomenal.
Yeah, he's amazing. And a lot of his stuff is based off of, either recent research or research that's become canonical or become, sort of fundamental to different aspects of perception. So he's great.
And so did you always have, a strong science background or science leaning? Like, was that something that was fostered in your home or at school?
It's kind of weird. Like I grew up in a Baptist household, a Southern Baptist household that didn't really go to church very much. And but I had my dad was in the Air Force, and he got a degree in the Air Force in electrical engineering. And so there was a lot of sci-fi at the house, a lot of old science fiction novels, Arthur C. Clarke and Larry Niven and stuff like that. And he had a subscription to Omni and to Scientific American and Smithsonian and Discover magazine. So by way of my dad, there was a lot of science in the house. But he was also really into what today you'd call like ancient aliens and stuff like that. He was very into conspiracy theories and had a lot of books like Chariots of the Gods and those sort of things. So I had a nice big mix of concepts that were all vying to tell you what is and what is not real, with a strong sciencey background too. And so I was really into mainly biology and neuroscience and stuff like that when I was growing up. And when I went to school, I was really committed to trying to get a degree in psychology. That's what I was fascinated with. So that all led to, even though I did journalism for the first part of my career, it all got kind of mushed together into what I'm doing now.
Yeah. And do you wish that you'd gone down the therapy route and done psychotherapy?
Sometimes I say yes to that, and sometimes I say no. Now that I know a lot of psychologists, and some of them are not just experimental psychologists, some of them are also therapists. I can say that I'm pretty happy with what I'm doing. But I do sometimes wish I was up in there with them. But the politics and the rigor and the sort of the gauntlet that is academia, they're always dissuading me. They're always saying, like, no. It's much better to write about what we're doing than to actually be doing it. Not that the people I talk to don't love what they do. They never tell me I should switch. I should just jump in. They're like, no, keep doing what you're doing. It's a really good thing, and we're happy you're doing it.
Yeah, I listened to your podcast on the replication crisis and did an episode of my own, and just the thought of having to get the next round of funding and the next grants and all of that. Yeah, academia is not the easiest place to be working.
No, and we were lucky enough to live through one of these transitional periods in that, the replication crisis is, that's just science being science. So it's kind of fun to watch. Some of the stuff I've written about, some of the things that are in my books are being either overturned or they're failing to replicate, and they're being updated. And I try to address that in the show, but that's neat. And it's a way to talk about how science works to people who are uninitiated. And there's also just the sense that academia as a whole is starting to change, and that the journals are, the journal system is not taking advantage of the power of the internet. It's not, the thing that what we get out of Wikipedia hasn't also been applied to how journals work, unless you know how to get to the papers, but most of them are behind really expensive paywalls.
Yeah.
And there's also just the institution of putting science into papers is a very complicated, messy human endeavor that is not. It just runs in parallel to the actual process of producing scientific works, and that's all undergoing a revolution right now, and it's neat for that to also be kind of included in the reportage of all this.
So I guess then, if we kind of start with some of the basics of, like, what's a logical fallacy, what's a heuristic, and what's a cognitive bias, and then we can start to go through some of these different options.
Yeah. Okay. So I started out writing mainly about those three topics, and now I've sort of moved into talking about belief and inference and models of reality and how that builds up to how people do and don't change their minds. I've been very fascinated with political science over the last 2 years, something I had not.
Who hasn't?
Yeah, right. I think because of the way the world has moved, whether it's with the 2016 election in the United States or Brexit, there's been a lot of, and just watching people argue on the internet, that became a real fascination of mine. Argumentation and persuasion became a real fascination of mine over the last couple of years. So that's where my podcast kind of is at now. It's also the book that I recently wrote that hasn't been published yet, but that's in that process is about all that. But I started out with what you're talking about, the biases, fallacies, and heuristics, which still is a foundation of the psychology of reasoning, which is really what You Are Not So Smart is about, the psychology of reasoning and decision making. And reasoning is exactly what it sounds like. It's coming up with reasons for what you believe. It's coming up with reasons to justify and explain your perception, or to persuade other people that the way you see things, whether it's factually, morally, or politically, is the right way to see them. And it all starts with this idea that the brain is a certainty-generating machine. It's a meaning maker, because uncertainty is maladaptive for any organism, and meaninglessness for humans in a social environment is maladaptive. That seems to be true because the brain would rather come to a conclusion and act than remain static, than remain doubtful in the moment. Because you can imagine that in the environment in which we evolved this brain, you need to, false positives are fine. It's okay to think that the rustling in the bush is a tiger, even if it's just wind, because, it's better to commit to a false positive than to get eaten. It's okay to be wrong if it keeps you alive, more often than not. So when we're faced with uncertainty, the mind tends to create certainty, and we're faced with meaninglessness. The mind creates meaning, and when we're faced with chaos, the mind will try to create order. Confusion tries to create narratives, and this is standard issue. So we're amazing at logic and reason and rationality. It's just that it's more that we're capable of those things, but we fall short of those in very predictable ways. In very predictable situations and contexts, we will commit to biases, fallacies, and heuristics. So a cognitive bias is just that. Bias means to be shifted at an angle, and they're predictable patterns of thought that were some of them are cultural and some of them are biological. Most of them are biological. It's just the way that neurons fire in brains when they're faced certain types of inputs. We will tend to think in certain ways that are predictable, and since they're predictable, there are certain ways we can be as it's been said before, like we're predictably irrational, as they like to say. Yep. So the weirdness, though, of that is that even though we make these very predictable mistakes in reasoning, we have this overconfidence that we didn't do that we arrived at our assumptions and conclusions through logic and through reason. And so that blind spot, the bias blind spot, as they call it, is something, and You're Not So Smart, I say, is the reason you're unaware of how unaware you are. So the bias is a tendency to think in one way, even when there are other options that are just as good or better. A heuristic, on the other hand, is a shortcut. It's a rule of thumb. It's a way to very quickly come to a conclusion or make a decision when thinking too much would take too long. And it's a sort of like, it leads to people mistaking the menu for the meal, mistaking the map for the territory, as they say. In the end, though, what it is you're trading accuracy for speed. You solve a difficult problem by solving a simpler problem. And oftentimes, when the simple problem solves in a way that doesn't fit to the more complicated problem. So that gets us into a lot of problems. And a logical fallacy is usually this is what happens when you're trying to follow the epistemic chain. That if you've ever took a philosophy class, is the idea of how do we know things? How do we believe things? How do we create propositions in which we try to implore other people to see things our way? When you are creating a proposition that you're saying something is true, or you're trying to convince someone of that, logical fallacies can appear whenever the steps that you're taking in order to create a proposition, you've made some sort of mistake. And this happens a lot of times when you are being challenged in some way and you're trying to create a counter argument to get to the conclusion that you're wanting to get to, the goal. You'll commit to what they call motivated reasoning. You're motivated to reason in a certain way because you're trying to get to the conclusion more than you're trying to get to the truth. And by warping logic, you often will commit some sort of logical fallacy. You'll get sort of tangled up in your own logic and twist language to make the world line up with your preconceived notions. And you take all those three things together, and there are these vast blind spots in our lives, these vast pockets of misconceptions that we commit to without even realizing it. And taken together, they can become the story of our lives without us knowing it.
So yeah, what I want to do is then just go through some of the different types of fallacies or heuristics, etc. So what about priming? I mean, you talk about this in the book about priming and how this can affect us.
Yeah, priming is one of those things that's not replicating very well. So we might ought to skip it, honestly, but I think the foundation of this is true. It's just that the research itself is not replicating as well as it used to. But the idea is simple, that every perception sets off a chain reaction so that the brain the brain is set up with an associative architecture. There's this idea of they call it the Baker phenomenon, where if I tell you that someone's name is John Baker versus I tell you that someone is a professional baker, and then an hour later I ask you to remember the person's name versus remembering their profession, you're much more likely to remember the person's profession because the brain associates Baker with a lot more things within the neural network than John Baker would be associated with. John Baker might not be associated with anything unless you know some other bakers or you know a famous John Baker. So since the brain is this vast associative architecture of ideas, thoughts, perceptions, and memories and concepts and so on, if you perceive every perception that you every time you are engaging in perception, it will set off a chain reaction of associations. So if you were to, for instance, one of the more famous studies in this was if you remember a sin from your past and then you're asked to wash your hands or not wash your hands, if you put in two different categories, some people get to wash their hands and some don't after remembering a sin from their past. And then at the end of that, both people in both groups are asked, would you like to do a little bit more research as a favor to the experimenters? People who did not wash their hands, 75% of them said yes versus about 40% of the people. The people who did not wash their hands were much more likely than the people who did wash their hands to actually go ahead and try to do the favor. The idea was that the people who washed their hands had somehow associated washing with also cleansing their the sin from the past. If they have that phrase sort of locked into their association network, washing away your sins, washing your hands, and so on and so forth. So there's been a hypothesis in psychology for a while that a lot of our behavior can be primed with very simple cues. And I think I think all that's still pretty valid. The idea that we are sensitive to cues in the environment without knowing that those cues have resulted in behaviors, thoughts, and emotions. And since it's very difficult to introspect accurately, we can behave in certain ways without knowing the antecedents of our behavior. And I think that's really sort of like the central tenet of what priming studies were aiming at exploring. But this is definitely one of those aspects of psychology that right now is undergoing a reinvention. A lot of the priming research is being re-examined, and they're trying to sort out exactly what it means and how it works.
And is that, you said that they're failing to replicate. I mean, you talked about the ultimatum game and priming that was done as part of that. Are those the studies that aren't replicating? No,
it's not those. It's more the studies that involve like cleaning up. If you smell cleaning fluid, you're more likely to clean a room. Like if you put people in a room and they have a lot of breadcrumbs, you put people in a room and they have to eat cookies, and some people get cookies that are more crumbly than others. And then at the end of the study, there would be all these crumbs in front of you. And they further divide people into being either in a room that smells like cleaning fluid or not. And people are more likely in a room that smells like cleaning fluid to clean up a crumbly cookie than people who are in a room that doesn't smell that way. Now, those studies are really hard to replicate because people are so nuanced and the conditions are so nuanced. I mean, how do you quantify crumbliness? It's very hard. So I think that in these cases, I'm not just as you shouldn't be quick to dismiss. It's quick to say that one study proves anything. You should be quick to say that one failure to replicate disproves it either. I think what we're seeing in those studies is that they came out. When those studies first came out, they were exciting and interesting, in that they can be spoken about very easily in the press. And then when you go try to dig deeper into them, there's going to be diminishing returns because you start to try to quantify things that in the beginning were it was okay to have a low fidelity, like crumbly can just be crumbly. And then as you go forward, crumbly needs to be quantified because you're really trying to be rigorous in your pursuit. So some of these studies, either they're having a hard time replicating them, or they're saying we need to find another way to look at this. But the idea that there's the idea that the brain has an associative architecture, the idea that it's very difficult to be aware of the things that nudge your behavior. It's very easy to be influenced in ways that you're unaware. All of that is sturdy and strong. It's just some of the more extreme primes, I think, are they're saying that may have been true in that one particular instance, but it's very difficult to make it happen every single time. Okay,
fine. What about the availability heuristic?
Well, the availability heuristic is nice and strong, and that's not going anywhere. This is the tendency to predict the frequency of an event, or the commonality of a fact, or the proportion of a characteristic within a population, based on how easily it is to bring an example of it to your mind. We're not. It's if I think in the book I talk about how if you ask how many words begin with R, versus how many words have R as their third letter. If I ask you to tell me, do you think there are more words that begin with R, or there are more words that have R as their third letter? Most people say there are more words that begin with R. And the reason is because it's just easier to think of. It's just easier to ping your memory and just start, coming up with words, that begin with R. Rat, rattlesnake, ratatouille. Hope said there we go. Rattle. Like I'm just. It's so hard. I can branch off of it so easily. Yeah. Versus car, target, lard. It's you have to do more. It's more cognitive effort involved to think of what's on the third slot in a word. Since it's harder to think of it, there's a strange inference leap that we make, which is that if it's almost like a line of logic in the brain. If difficult to cognate, then less likely. And so you see this all the time when we say, like, if someone gets sick from a flu shot, you might be less likely to try to get a flu shot from that point on, even though it's purely anecdotal. It's much easier for you to conjure that than it is for you to think about the statistics of flu shots, or to even look up those statistics. If you see a news story about someone dying after getting a flu shot, that one case could be enough to just make you never get a flu shot the rest of your life, even though it's so statistically unlikely that would ever happen. And in the other direction, this is why shark attack stories lead people to avoid the water, even though you may be 1,000 times more likely to be killed by like a falling coconut. I think that's actually the statistics. It actually is true. You're more likely to die if you live on an island. You're more likely to die from a falling coconut than from a shark attack. I've seen that listed somewhere. But this whole thing is about humans are bad when it comes to thinking statistically, but we're very good when we're thinking about thinking anecdotally or emotionally. And so the availability heuristic makes it so that you're far more likely to believe something is commonplace. You can just find one or two examples of it than you are to believe in something you've never heard of or seen before.
And does that then sort of tap in as well to confirmation bias in terms of people finding easy evidence available that then supports their already the beliefs that they already hold?
Well, confirmation bias is like the foundation of all of this, right? Okay. Confirmation bias. I mean, everything I've ever written about, even now, is always going to come back to either confabulation or confirmation bias. It's going to come back to that all the time. And we can talk about confabulation. But confirmation bias is the tendency to it's often, I think, misunderstood or misrepresented. It works like this. If you don't know why something is happening in the natural world, you're going to form a hunch without having any you don't have to put any effort into it. It's going to appear automatically in your mind. I have a hunch as to why this is. And we have a tendency, once we have that hunch, if we want to go looking for confirmation that we're correct, and we often do, we will stop looking for more information once we have confirmed the hunch. So that's pretty much how confirmation bias works. We are biased in favor of confirmation versus disconfirmation. So if you think vaccines cause autism, or you think that people did not land on the moon, it was all a hoax, or you think the earth is flat, or any manner of things that if you go on the internet, you can find evidence to prove that you're not correct. You can find disconfirming evidence. If you go in search of confirmation instead, you're going to find that confirmation. There's plenty of places online that's going to say, yeah, vaccines cause autism. There's plenty of places online that are going to tell you all about how the moon landing was a hoax. You're going to find plenty of people on the internet that gather together in public spaces and talk about how the earth is flat. And if you're aiming to confirm your hypothesis or your hunch, you're going to get what you ask for, and you'll stop looking for more information. They actually, in psychology, call that the make sense stopping rule. And they're not always very elegant with their terminology in psychology. And but the crazy thing about that is that science itself, not the institution, but the tool, the practice, the methodology, science as a tool was invented to bypass this natural human predilection. When you instead look to disconfirm your hypothesis, and you will quickly arrive at the truth versus if you look to confirm it. I mean, you can think of anything you want from antiquity, whether it's the belief in witches or that the earth, the sun revolves around the earth. If you're looking for confirmation that we live in a geocentric universe, you just have to look outside and watch the sun rise and set. I mean, there's no way to. I mean, that seems like confirmation, right? But if you're looking for disconfirmation, you have to put that aside. You have to look deeper. And the same is true for whether you're a scientist or you're an average person. The internet, Google plus confirmation bias is a really dangerous combination because we all now have the power right in our pockets to confirm anything that we believe, and it can lock you into belief. It can keep you from updating your priors and changing your mind, and moving with the pace of social change. If you want to, especially if your identity is wrapped up in a belief that you don't want to lose, so. That's the power of confirmation bias, and it's the very reason we have science in the first place, is to say, I know that could be a witch, but maybe it's not. So let's look for evidence that could just confirm our hypothesis. And once you do that, you're going to find it, and that's how we move forward.
And so you mentioned, bias plus Google is not a great thing. So what do you think about advancements in technology? Is this making us worse with biases? Is it making more inconsistencies? And then also thinking about machine learning and AI. So how do you think about that?
Right now, the spaces in which we gather online are not really interested in helping us disconfirm our preconceived notions. Social media, we could gather anywhere we wanted on the internet. We could gather anywhere we want, but we tend to gather on Facebook and Twitter, and then to a lesser extent, places like, Instagram or Reddit or wherever it is, whatever your watering hole happens to be. But most of us are hanging out on Facebook and Twitter. Those are companies that want to make money, and they make money through engagement. And engagement means how long will you stay on the site, how much stuff you click on, how much stuff will you share. As long as their motive is profit, confirmation bias works in their favor. It wasn't until recently that they realized that maybe they have an obligation, or that maybe they have a responsibility to be careful about how their algorithms designed to increase engagement for advertisers could be weaponized by people who are trying to increase engagement for ideas, for concepts, or political views, or opinions that could create discord, which is exactly what's happened. Is simply taking the tools that were created for one purpose and repurposing them for disinformation campaigns, which is very easy to do for political beliefs, because political beliefs are tied to identity, and anything tied to identity is going to bypass the normal updating process. The normal updating process of, okay, I've received enough counter evidence to suggest that the evidence that I currently hold as support for my belief can be downgraded, and so I will slowly shift my understanding in the direction of the new evidence that's being presented before me. We do that for just about everything. If I simply tell you, if you think it's Tuesday and it's actually Monday, it's very easy for me to get you to change your mind. If you think the Great Wall of China is the only object visible from space, I can just show you other objects that are visible from space, and you're like, oh, okay, I'm wrong about that. But if your belief is tied to identity, that's a much more important social construct. It serves a vital function to the coherence of our internal models. And that means that you're going to be much more likely to change your mind if changing your mind means also affecting your identity. And that's been weaponized with Facebook and Twitter by just simply giving people the opportunity to signal to their peers that they're on the right side or that they're on the correct side and that the other side is bad. And if that's sort of your goal, if you're trying to seek confirmation that you're on the right side, or you're trying to seek confirmation that your political beliefs are sound, or you're trying to seek confirmation that the other side is bad and that's why you're not on it, there have been nefarious actors out there who over the last couple of years have given you as much of that information as you'd like. And we're sharing it at a really rapid pace, and it's causing people to enter into very isolated, insular social worlds in which the confirmation bias gets even stronger and stronger and stronger. We haven't quite figured out what we're going to do about this because it's asking a lot of these companies to pursue a different goal. And so some of the people I've spoken to think that the onus is on the user. And so there's debate, like, should these tools make it easier for us to think? Like it's not like this stuff is new. I mean, this has been around ever since there's been newspapers, ever since there's been books, ever since there's been information in politics. This has been around. Brains have always done this. So I have a sense that people in my generation and younger are just going to. They just have a. It's just going to have to be a case of literacy, right? A case of understanding how it all works and being aware that maybe just because it's on the internet, it's not true. And the other side of it is the people like myself and others have got to tell as many people as possible about these things like confirmation bias. Because once you know it's there, it's not necessarily that you can stop yourself from doing it, but you can be less likely to blindly share a story just because it confirms what you thought was true in the first place.
So because that's one thing I've thought about, like learning about different biases and fallacies. Does it make you less irrational, or do you just think that you're being less irrational and then still participating?
Well, there's good news and bad. It doesn't necessarily make you more. I mean, yes, we can be more rational, okay, and once you sort of have an idea of how this works, you're less likely to fall prey to things that are obviously, and like whether it's psychics or astrology or flat earthers or homeopathy, stuff like that. Like you're less likely to fall prey to it. But then again, the reason you're less likely to fall prey to it is because those things have been identified by other people within a community of people who are trying to like avoid these things. Things that have yet to be put on the radar, that's going to be up to each individual to find. That's kind of hard to do, especially if it's something that isn't really under the watchful eye of science. Whether if you're trying to decide whether or not a certain politician is worth your support, you're going to fall prey to confirmation bias, even though you know it exists. The only way out of it that I've seen that's reliable is recognizing that almost all of these things that I write about are adaptive when it's being done in a group setting, and they're maladaptive when they're being done individually, because we tend to we think in lazy and biased ways when we're producing our reasoning, and we tend to be more contemplative and stringent when we are trying to absorb the reasoning of another person. That's why you can always tell when other people are self-deluded, but you can never tell when you're self-deluded. And that makes sense if we think of human beings are social creatures that live in collectives, and we developed culture and social norms as sort of tools and adaptations for living in groups of people with other minds and who are sharing information back and forth. And so, if one person learns something new and they try to bring it to the group's attention, the group can vet that as adding it to the collective, database by just listening to their rationale and their reasoning. And this it seems to be true that, there are all sorts of things that I've written about in the past, the psychological tests that people fail individually, but when you put them in a group, they tend to pass. The Wason selection task, which is too complicated to go into, but it's a task that, like 90% of people fail individually, but in a group setting, they don't fail at all. They never fail. And confirmation bias is another example of that. Like, of course, we're going to be biased in favor of our own arguments, but when we listen to the arguments of other people, or we present our arguments to other people, that's when other people will take on the role of the disconfirming voice. And I think the main problem of what's happening online is that we often feel like we're in a group setting when we're not. When you're on Facebook, you're really alone. You're seeing a different Facebook than anybody else is seeing. And only 30% of users know that. 70% of users of Facebook at all age groups, young people, old people in the middle, they think that we're all sharing the same Facebook. They're unaware that the algorithms are putting you in filter bubbles. And we end up in this situation where we're alone together. And that's a really bad environment for reasoning to take place. When you are actually in a group of people, that's when a lot of these biases become less pernicious and less dangerous. So I think that one of the best ways to deal with this going forward is trying to create social environments. If we're going to gather on the internet more than we're going to gather in pubs and more than we're going to gather in town halls, then we have to make the internet more like town halls and pubs, because it's much more likely that people are going to question you and to challenge you because there's not some algorithm that's making sure that you only see what you want to see, and there's no Google to only get the information that you want to get.
So you mentioned there were kind of two big parts that are bedrock of everything else. So there's confirmation bias and there's confabulation. So do you want to talk about confabulation?
Oh yeah, confabulation. Like I wish everybody in the world knew this word. I mean, this is such an important thing. I'll explain this using a study that I always use. There was this great study by Nisbet and Miller back in the 70s. They set up a display in a department store. And they arranged nylon stockings side by side. And when people came by, they asked people to say which of the stockings, there were 4 of them, was the best one. And almost every single person chose the stocking on the right-hand side, the far right. But the trick, of course, is that all the stockings came out of the same pack. They're identical. So there's nothing different about them except where they are placed on the table. Now, the people didn't know that. So when they're asked, why did you pick that stocking? They will say, it's the color or the quality, or it reminds me of my mom, or something like that. They would say they had a reason. They had a rationale for why they chose what they chose. But whatever they told the experimenter was not the reason why they chose what they chose. The reason they chose what they chose is because of something called the serial position effect in cultures that read from left to right. And when all things are being equal and you're making a decision under uncertainty, you tend to go with the last thing you saw, which would be the last one you picked up. Now, that's the real reason they did it. But they don't know the real reason they did it. And the brain's not going to let you say, I don't know. I have no idea why I did what I just did. I'm just some weird biological, robot doing stuff. Don't know. So instead, they search for a reasonable explanation for their own behavior. And then they present that to the other party. And when you present a reasonable explanation for your behavior that also happens to not be true, that's called confabulation. And that example sort of demonstrates how easy it is and how often we might do it. But it's much more often and much more pervasive than you might think, because we know, thanks to a number of syndromes like Korsakoff syndrome, which is when someone has amnesia about recent events, but they can recall their past. if you ask someone where they've been over the last few weeks, they'll tell you. If they're in a hospital, they'll say, and you ask them why they're in the hospital, they'll say because they work there. They really need to get back to work, even though they're a patient. There are people that have something called anosognosia, where you're paralyzed, but you won't admit. Anosognosia means the denial of disease. So a person could have, say, like a paralyzed left arm, but they won't admit that their arm is paralyzed. And so if you ask them to pick up something with the left arm, they'll just say, I don't want to. And you say, well, why can't you pick up your arm or something? They'll say, because that's not actually my arm. That's my mom's arm. They're playing a trick on me. They come up with these very elaborate rationales and narratives that are completely untrue. But they have no idea they're doing it. They believe what they're saying. There are a lot of these. Capgras syndrome, a delusion, is when you believe your close friends and family have been replaced by imposters. Cotard's syndrome is when a person believes that they are an imposter, that they've died and that they are now a spirit in the afterlife, or that they're a robot or something. And the thing that is most powerful when it comes to confabulation are split brain patients, people who have had a corpus callostomy in which the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere have been almost completely severed. Since most of our language is produced by the left hemisphere, and since one hemisphere receives one eye's information and the other hemisphere receives the other, you can show people images that don't reach the left hemisphere, and thus the left hemisphere is not able to speak what the person's seeing. And what you can do in those situations is you can show someone a picture of like a car crash victim, and then that to the hemisphere that can't speak, and the person will feel disgusted, and they'll ask, "What's wrong with you?" And they'll say, "Oh, I had something terrible to eat during lunchtime," or they can show them a funny picture, and they'll laugh, and they'll say, "Why are you laughing?" And they'll say, "It's because I was remembering a joke that somebody told me yesterday." They will immediately and unconsciously confabulate to explain their own feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. And these examples all demonstrate that that's what we're doing every second of our day. And sometimes we're telling you the accurate antecedent, and sometimes we're just making stuff up. And the evidence suggests we're making stuff up a lot. And so we're often unaware of why we do what we do, why we think what we think, why we feel what we feel. But it doesn't stop us from coming up with stories to explain those things. And as my friend Will Storr says, when someone's giving you their reasoning for why they hold a position or why they believe something, that's probably the thing you should be most skeptical of in the world, because our stories are likely the most fabricated thing we produce. And that's what confabulation is all about. And I think knowing that gives you this amazing humility for yourself, and while at the same time providing this incredible empathy for other people. And I think if you are not so smart about anything, is that I want people to feel more of both of those emotions. And I think that that's sort of the real side benefit of science itself. There's the whole thing about awe and wonder, but it's also this other thing about humility and empathy. And I think there's a real way to connect to that through the science of self-delusion, or in the psychology of reasoning and decision-making.
And I think, for me, the whole confabulation part sort of fell down a lot when I listened to first hearing Sam Harris talk about free will, and then reading his book, and then reading Robert Sapolsky's book Behave. And that's basically just this 700-page treatise about why free will is an illusion, and that we just really sort of cannot explain why we do what we do, even though we think we can.
Yeah, I have Behave sitting right behind me. I'm going to have Sapolsky on the show soon, hopefully. But yeah, it's creepy. I get it. Nobody wants to think that there's some sort of automaton made out of atoms and molecules and bits and bolts, and we're just adhering to the physical laws of the universe. I get it. But, it's healthy to understand a couple things. One, psychology is really young. Yeah. Neuroscience is even younger. We've only been doing this for about 100 years. And it's still kind of astronomy without telescopes. So we have barely scratched the surface of all this. So it's pretty early to leap to any conclusion, especially the free will stuff. I mean, we've been debating that stuff for thousands of years.
Yeah.
and we can come to all sorts of philosophical conclusions, but like when it comes to hardcore science with microscopes and charts and graphs and published papers, we just got started. So I wouldn't commit to anything just yet.
Okay, cool. Well, it just was interesting in terms of having my mind melt a little bit as I started to really think about it.
No, that's good. I mean, like, I want everybody to do that. I'm with you on that. Mine does too. Like, I think it's like if you have never considered those things, it is really healthy because it's totally possible. Like, it's totally possible. We have no free will, and I know that's scary and sucks. But to get yourself to the point where you can be okay with that could be true, it's a pretty neat place.
Yeah. So look, I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to ask like a final question. And I don't know if this is going to be a question that's difficult to answer, but I thought it probably ties into your most recent book, or the one you said you're writing about, which is how do you get people to change their mind? And like, what are the things that have been demonstrated actually work?
Well, okay, that's about 6 hours of stuff. But yeah, I can talk about it briefly. I think the first thing you need to do, though, is answer, what do you mean when you say mind, right? That's the thing that oddly enough, even the first researchers into persuasion did not do that. Like, at first, persuasion was thought to be all about learning. Like, did the person learn what you're trying to tell them? And that's because it's a mix of a couple things. There's something called naive realism, which is the idea that if people don't believe what you believe, it's because they don't have the facts that you have. And if they just had the facts that you have, then they'll change their minds, because naturally they're going to see things the way you see things. So it was this like the idea that people might agree on the facts but interpret them differently is often the first stumbling block. That, if I send you a link and say, look at this link, and you look at it and go, that's often the first stumbling block. You're like, well, that person's obviously crazy or stupid or there's something wrong with them. That's the idea. Because they should see things the way you see them. So that's the first stumbling block. To put that off to the side and just know that everybody's going to interpret evidence through the lens that they have available to them, their experiences, their identities, their rationales, their motivations. That's going to guide how people make sense of things. Knowing that means if you want to change somebody's mind, you're going to have to go back up a little bit, and you're going to have to not focus on the facts. You're going to have to focus on their motivations, their identity, and their experiences and their models of reality, and all the other things that go into interpretation. So, when it comes to changing someone's mind, knowing that's true, you have to identify what is it you're trying to change. Are you trying to change their belief? Are you trying to change their attitude? Are you trying to change their values? Are you trying to change their opinions? Those are all different psychological constructs, and they're all going to require different strategies. They're related, like, attitudes are sort of a form of belief, and values are sort of a form of attitude. And they're all related and connected, and they sort of build on top of each other. But a good example of this is, I've talked about this a lot, about the backfire effect. It was originally the model of the backfire effect used to be about belief, and now it's about attitudes. And that's something that happens a lot. That's happened a lot in psychology, is psychology figured it out, but then political science made the same mistake because they didn't check each other's notes. Is this getting beliefs and attitudes mixed up? In World War II, they created all these propaganda campaigns, American propaganda. Of course, they didn't call it propaganda, but they had created these campaigns to like change the minds of American soldiers. They wanted them to. There was a big belief in World War II America that the UK wasn't fighting hard enough against the Germans, and that America was going to swoop in and like save them. And there was also the belief that the World War II would be over in just like 7 months or something. As soon as America got involved, it'd be over, because there was another belief that Germany was this really tiny country that didn't have a very big military. So those are three strong beliefs that the United States military really hoped to change in the American public among soldiers, so that they could keep morale up when those soldiers realized they were wrong. So they created multi-million-dollar campaigns to these videos, or films they watched during training. And the films worked great. They changed those soldiers' minds about all those things before they watched them versus after they watched them. After they watched the films, they would be like, yeah, okay, I see Germany's got a lot of money and a big military. And I see that, oh, yeah, actually the UK is fighting really hard. The RAF is they're keeping Hitler at bay. And I also see that the war is probably going to last a long time, or that the war is going to be a lot harder than I thought. But they would agree to all that, but then they would ask them, well, what's your attitude? And their attitudes would be totally unchanged. They'd still think the UK wasn't doing their fair share. They were going to be saved by the States. They still thought that Germany was kind of an irrelevant power, and they still thought that the war would be over very quickly, despite updating their beliefs. So they learned in that research that beliefs and attitudes are separate. So I know I'm taking a long time to answer this question, but it's a whole book's worth of stuff. So it's important to understand, number one, people don't believe facts are not the way in there. Like, facts are important, but the standard way to correct someone. I mean, the standard way to correct somebody's reason or their concept of what is and is not true is to just depend on Bayesian reasoning. And if you've never heard of Bayesian or Bayesian or Bayesian, however you want to pronounce it, that's just the idea that with every new piece of information, your confidence in one belief or another should go up or down. So if you think that it's if you think your hamster is alive, and then you come home and as you start to walk in the room, you smell something off, your confidence that your hamster is alive is going to start going down. Let's say you were 100%, you were 90% confident your hamster was alive, and then you smell the whiff of death, and you go down to 75, and then you walk in the room and you see your hamster lying there motionless. Now you're going down to 50, and then you go pick up your hamster and it doesn't move. You go down to 40, and then you try to play with your hamster. You put him in the wheel and nothing happens, and you go down to 10, and then finally the hamster's cold and you buried it in the ground, and it's been a couple of weeks, and now you've gone down to 0. So, or you've gone down. You're supposed to never go down to 0, so we could say you've gone down to like 1 or 5, because you could have been deluded the whole time. That's the idea of Bayesian updating, and you can help somebody along in that process. If somebody tells you they believe that, I think a good example, Harriet Hall said that she had a friend who thought that neck manipulation could relieve obstructions of blood flow to the brain, and she, being knowledgeable about the subject, said that that's not physiologically possible, and then handed over the research that showed this, and then also gave the person an opportunity to contact another expert on the topic, and that person updated all their priors. They had based their inference on a fact that turned out to not what they thought was a fact. They had read that it was possible, and they had confidence in that source, and they thought that was a fact. It turned out not to be a fact. This person helped them along the way. There's that for a person who has no other investment in that topic. That's the easy way to update their priors, as long as you replace the evidence that you take away. You can't just tell people they're wrong. You've got to give them something to put in the location that you just yanked out the old information. But if a person if their identity is wrapped up in the belief that, let's say they actually are a person who manipulates people's necks, then now they have a vested interest in not accepting that evidence, and you're going to require more than that to switch them over. So in the book, I talk about 3 or 4 things that seem to work in that regard. Like when we're talking about digging into motivated reasoning, because that's what we're talking about here is motivated reasoning. People who want to believe, people who have we are not motivated by accuracy in certain situations. If our identity is at stake, if our status among trusted peers is at stake, or a causal narrative is integral to the model that gives us that makes the world make sense to us. In all 3 of those instances, you're going to resist updating your priors, because you're basically asking a person to give up the model they use to predict the world and to make sense of it. And there's no way we're going to just throw the model out without another one to replace it. And so in those cases, your motivation is not going to be accuracy. It's going to be these other goals. So you have to give people the opportunity to meet those goals by accepting the new evidence. So if a person's identity is at stake, you have to give them the opportunity to maintain their identity, or to effortlessly slide into a identity that they're just as happy to keep, if you want them to accept the evidence that currently threatens that identity. Same thing with the group status. Like, if by accepting a certain amount of certain information, they might lose their status among trusted peers, you have to make that information safe in that regard, if that's their main objection. And when it comes to causal narratives, it's very easy in that case. You just have to make sure that whatever you take away, you put something in its place so they can have some sort of cause and effect narrative that is plausible. In the book, I talk about something called deep canvassing. And then there's another thing, which is the elaboration likelihood model. And then I talk about narrative persuasion, and I talk about moral reframing. In each case, what you've got is a system. Each one does something similar. Each one does something specific. I mean, that either addresses identity, group status, or causal narrative. And so I guess to get any deeper in this, I'm going to have to give you another 30-minute answer. But I think if I had to give you like a very quick answer, it's like, remember, the facts you can't just lean on the facts. In some cases, yes. In some cases, not, because we don't treat all of our beliefs the same. And if a person's resisting you, because if a person refuses to believe, for instance, that I like to use the moon landing because it's kind of politically safe. If a person thinks that the landing on the moon was a hoax, and you're trying to give them evidence that it wasn't, and they seem to be resisting, the facts of the matter are not what's actually at play here. There's an attitude underneath that's driving their desire to believe that. They have a desire to believe that. And that desire is coming from somewhere else. It might be group status. It might be identity. It might be some sort of long-held attitude that comes from a distrust of authority or something like that. This is where you have to go if you want to convince that person. The facts are not going to be your way in. And for a long time, we've done something called the information deficit hypothesis, which is that you just give people more facts and they'll eventually, figure it out. And that's not going to be the way in. But don't take people's resistance as being that they're unreachable. I think pretty much everyone is reachable. It's just going to be, what is either you're going to have to use a different method than you're currently using, or you're going to have to provide them with an amount of counter evidence that's just too much to hand in one conversation on Facebook. But don't lose hope, because there are ways to do it. Well, I guess we could talk about that some way or somewhere off, but I've got there's so many things that go into it, but that's the main thing.
I know I've asked you for basically a book's worth of response in 5 minutes. So no, look, that it just is more reason for why I need to then check out that book. So look, David, this has been great. I've got a long list of questions that we didn't even get to, so I might have to do a round 2 at some point if you're up for it.
Yeah, no problem at all. Just get in touch with me.
Cool. So look, for people who've enjoyed the show, where can they find out more about you? And where do you want to point people towards?
Yeah, actually, if that last thing we were talking about was like, oh my God, how much stuff is he going to say? My podcast, You Are Not So Smart, you can find it at youarenotsosmart.com, and it's also on SoundCloud as You Are Not So Smart, Stitcher, iTunes, all those stuff. A lot of the episodes over the last year or 2 years have addressed these things. So like I talked about elaboration likelihood model. There's a whole episode about that and all the things I was talking about earlier. So the best way to find it is just go into youarenotsosmart.com. That's where it's all at.
Perfect. Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been awesome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7health.com.